at least at 3 occasions since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Russians have proposed a new security arrangement for Europe in the context of the OSCE, treaty-based with the Security Council. The last time they made a proposal less ambitious, this was in the 90s, less ambitious one was in December 2021 when they proposed to open a conversation with NATO on the one hand, with the US on the other hand, to try to find an arrangement which would create a stable security system, not just for Europe.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I have the very great privilege of talking to one of Switzerland's former top diplomats, Ambassador Jean-Daniel Ruch. Ambassador Ruch retired last year from Switzerland's diplomatic service and recently published a very insightful book with the title Crimes, Hate, Tremors, From One Cold War to Another in Pursuit of Peace and Justice. Among his many postings, Ambassador Ruch worked at the OSCE and as Special Envoy for the Middle East in Berne before he was appointed ambassador to Serbia and Montenegro in 2012, to Israel in 2016, and to Türkiye from 2021 to 2023. Ambassador Ruch, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on your program.
It's fantastic to speak to a diplomat with such long experience in actual current diplomatic affairs, in neutrality and in mediation. And I wanted to start with a latter part of your book in which you describe your own experiences in Istanbul with the only real chance at an early peace in the Russo-Ukrainian war. I'm speaking of the negotiations in March and April of that year that happened there, and which in the end we now know were sabotage. But you were involved in this discussion in what way?
Yeah, well, at one point, we were contacted. Switzerland was contacted by the mediator, Türkiye, to talk about neutrality, because they said, among the 4 or 5 blocks of the negotiations, one of them was how to define a status of neutrality for Ukraine. Neutrality with security guarantees, because the Ukrainians insisted and still insist on security guarantees. And the Turks told us, well, we are members of NATO, we don't know much about neutrality. That's why we would like to cooperate with you on defining what this neutrality status should be. But just a few days later, the talks collapsed, and there was never really a follow-up on this conversation.
But did you ever find out why the talks collapsed? We have some reports from Naftali Bennett, the then Prime Minister of Israel, that the talks collapsed after Boris Johnson visited. We have statements from Boris Johnson to that extent as well, that the Western alliance actually told Ukraine to keep fighting. Do you also have any more information on what it was that collapsed?
Well, what the Turks told me then was some powers have a more global agenda, and they want to weaken Russia. And this was said by the Secretary of Defense of the United States himself just a few days after the talks collapsed. So I think there is no doubt anymore. I mean, only those who are moved by ideological considerations can redispute that fact.
In your book, you mentioned 4 points that were the key pillars of the peace, the proposed peace agreements. And one of these pillars was actually a return of Ukraine to neutrality. And the Russians made this explicit, right? They used that term, and Ukraine had a neutrality article in its constitution until 2014, then got rid of it, replaced it by the aspiration to join NATO. Why do you think it is the Russians that wanted neutrality back?
But you can look at that in a deep historical perspective. I believe that the vision of European security Russian way is to avoid a direct clash, meaning a direct contact between the military blocs. And what their vision was to have, as still is, I think, is to have buffer zone with neutral states between them and NATO. And one of them, of course, the centerpiece of that buffer zone would be Ukraine. I'm talking about the historical perspective because that's exactly the system that Tsar Alexander, put in place after the Napoleonic Wars by creating a range of neutral states between France and the Germanic powers. And that's why Switzerland became neutral. It was a Russian idea. And I think that this conception that two major powers should not touch themselves so as to reduce the risk of war is still present probably in the Russian mind, which is also defined by other things like the immensity of the territory and the absence of natural obstacles like the Alps, like we have here. So it is very much in line with traditional Russian strategy to want a buffer zone between them and NATO.
In Western media, we have read for the last 3 years that the Russians are unwilling to negotiate, that you cannot negotiate with Vladimir Putin, that Vladimir Putin and the Russians only know violence. Do you buy into this? What is your personal experience with Russian diplomacy?
No, well, this is ideology. You know, there is a terrible battle going on to control the narratives or to win the narratives. And we see even in Switzerland, the main media outlets, those who used to have a very high reputation, they just buy into this NATO propaganda. Now, I think that the first step towards neutrality is to have the right assessment of the situation and to look at the facts and the interests of the various actors and the real positions beyond the narratives, the statements, and the propaganda. What I can say on this subject, I've been involved in trying to redefine European security since the fall of the Berlin Wall, especially in the context of the OSCE. At least at 3 occasions since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Russians have proposed a new security arrangement for Europe in the context of the OSCE, treaty-based with the Security Council. The last time they made a proposal less ambitious, this was in the 90s, less ambitious one was in December 2021 when they proposed to open a conversation with NATO on the one hand, with the US on the other hand, to try to find an arrangement which would create a stable security system, not just for Europe. Let's not forget that the whole nuclear security architecture that had been defined since the 70s between the Soviet Union then and the United States has largely collapsed since George W. Bush in 2003 left the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was very much the cornerstone of this whole nuclear predictability or the system that was put in place to prevent a nuclear war. And I think that was the other part of the discussion they wanted to have with the United States. But those who said no to those talks are not the Russians. These were the Americans. And if you look at history and how much the Soviet Union and then Russia complied by the agreements, I don't think you can really say that it was the Russians or the Soviets who were the parties who abandoned or who violated agreements. No, usually the Russians have a proven track record, I believe, to stick by their word, as long as it's in their interest, of course. But this is why you need to have these permanent consultations and communications between the great powers. And the OSCE would have offered the right, the right forum to have a permanent structure for European security. And by the way, Switzerland, and not only Switzerland, but the other neutral states played a key role back then to create this system, which unfortunately remained embryonic because the West wanted to push its advantage as much as possible while Russia was weak.
There's very good research on that, on what happened between 1970 and 75, the negotiations that led up to the CSCE process and then ultimately to the institutionalization in the OSCE. And there was this moment when during the Cold War, everything was de-escalated. And somebody I had on this channel, US Ambassador Jack Matlock, keeps emphasizing that the Cold War was not ended when the Soviet Union collapsed in 91. It was ended in 1989 when both sides negotiated it to an end because it was in both sides' interest to end it. And then something happened. Something happened that this cooperative mood completely changed to something that ruined the entire security structure we had, and that actually the Russians were on board with creating. Can you explain to yourself what it was that killed the post-Cold War peace?
Well, I think that there are really two aspects I wish to emphasize here. Of course, it would be a very long explanation, but I think there are really two aspects. One of them, the Americans were drunk with their victory. They were convinced, and they are still convinced today, that they are the only superpower, that they have to rule the world. This is a trend you see in the mind of the Americans for quite a long time, ever since the Manifest Destiny, if you want to go back into history. And then from that point of view, they could not tolerate to talk to anybody as equals. That's the first thing. The second thing, some of the states that suffered under Soviet rule, I'm thinking about the Baltic states or Poland also, of course, they really demanded, the Czechs also, they really demanded security guarantees from the United States, and they wanted to join NATO because they have also their own historical perspective, which is, okay, the Russians may be weak now, but that will not last forever. So therefore, as to guarantee our sovereignty, we need this strong alliance with the United States that NATO provides. I think these are the two key aspects which prevented the creation of a collective system of security encompassing the whole of Europe, or from Vancouver to Vladivostok, as we used to talk in the OSCE.
Do you still have hope left for the OSCE and for the revival of this Cold War détente in the new Cold War?
I think the ball is very much on the court of the Trump administration. Now, they have proven to be totally unpredictable, so I have no idea what is going to happen. But the Russians have made it clear that they are not interested in a ceasefire in Ukraine. This ceasefire, or they want a peace treaty, but of course the first step could be a ceasefire, but they see that in the context of European security and a profound reshaping of European security. Now, the Russians feel they are in a position of strength now because they steadily make some gains. There are many reports about the weakness of the Ukrainian army. Europe is in a very difficult situation. It will be very difficult, especially if Trump reduces the US engagement. It will be very difficult for the Europeans to compensate in terms of money and especially weapon systems, because the production capability is just not there. So I think the Russians are not in a mood to make any sort of concessions. Therefore, and since they want to have a new security order, or let's say to talk in a more global context, the only institution which exists where all states are represented on an equal footing, who have an interest in European security, meaning including US and Canada, is the OSCE. So Switzerland will have the presidency of the OSCE in 2026, and I would definitely advise Switzerland to connect early on, certainly with the US administration, but also with the Russian administration, to see how we can usefully play a role there to bring the parties together, and by the same token, try to restore a little bit the credibility of our neutrality, which has been badly damaged since 2022.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because the propaganda at this time is extreme, in my view, especially in Europe, on how things are framed and how things are being explained or not explained and hidden from understanding. The Switzerland is clearly is neutral de jure, and has also said it's going to behave neutrally according to the rules of The Hague and is not sending weapons to Ukraine. But on the other hand, it is clearly in the camp of the West, and it was the hosting spot for that peace summit back in summer that ultimately really turned out to be, in my view, quite useless or even counterproductive, because it creates this dichotomy between us and them.
We offer the propaganda stage.
For the propaganda stage. So where is Switzerland going? And is there still a way for Europeans to remain neutral? Are there still neutral Europeans in your view?
Maybe Ireland. Listen, I think that the neutrality has to be seen like a building with 3 floors. The lower floor is the law of neutrality, which is basically the Hague Convention of 1907, which is saying you should not offer any military advantage to any of the conflicting parties. And they're okay. From that point of view, legally speaking, we are neutral. The second stage is the policy of neutrality. And this is very much defined by the government with little consultation of the parliament or anybody else. And by taking the sanctions, which was an act, a political act with implications on neutrality, then, and this is the third stage, we influence the perception of neutrality. To be credible, we need to be perceived as neutral. And unfortunately, because of this decision and others, also the looming accession to NATO, the perception of neutrality is not there anymore among certain big world powers. I don't say it's lost forever, but it will be an uphill struggle to restore the credibility in our neutrality.
I agree with you. And let me just also ask about how you witnessed this change in the Nordics, with Sweden and Finland going from being famously neutral as well, non-aligned, and to full members of NATO, and now even having each between 15 and 17 new US bases on their soil and being militarized to the teeth against Russia. How do you explain to yourself that also happened within the span of the last, let's say, 10, 15 years?
Well, actually, the accession to NATO happened like this within a few months.
Yeah. But the precursors
after the invasion, and I think it was an aggression, by the way, by Russia against Ukraine. Sweden and Finland are a bit different cases. I don't think you can put them in the same package. What they have in common is a border with Russia, and therefore they have also reasons to be afraid of potential Russian actions, destabilization, hybrid warfare in Sweden and Finland. But let's start with Finland. Finland had a war with Russia. With the Soviet Union back then. We should not forget it. So they have that in their history, and a bit like Poland, for them, they were obliged to be Finlandized, as we said back then. So to have the status of neutrality after the Second World War, but they were never really asked about that. So I think that what has been perceived as revanchism, renewed militarism from Russia has raised alarm bells in Finland. And for them, a bit like Poland, so that's a way to secure their sovereignty to join NATO. Sweden, I think, is a bit different. They were never really convinced to be. I'm talking about the government. If you look at the history of the past 20 years, there have been several attempts and several statements from Swedish leaders saying neutrality is something from the past. Now we have to move on and join NATO. And simply now they found the opportunity because of this Russian aggression against Ukraine. So these are the two different cases. But even before they formally joined NATO, their military had been prepared to join NATO through all sorts of measures, the kind of measures we are taking in Switzerland now, by the way, in terms of what they called interoperability, which is actually giving the management of our army to NATO. or to the Americans, let's be clear.
Well, why are we doing that? I mean, I've observed that too in Switzerland, that there's so much push from certain corners of our government. Your former boss, Viola Amherd, I think, is one of the key of the key
Well,
political figures of that, to push for giving up Switzerland's defense structure to NATO. And there's no threat to Switzerland. Why does Switzerland now try to make itself a problem to other powers?
well, I think it's because of the deep penetration of the American, but also Israeli influences in all our military system. It's not just the army in uniform, it's also the procurement system. I mean, the way the F-35 was selected is a scandal. A national counselor from the Socialist Party has written a book about that. And it's either incompetence or corruption. There is no other way. But it's definitely a scandal. And what it tells is that our security system, all of them, all aspects, are deeply penetrated by these influences. And that's also why they launched a smear campaign against me when I was appointed State Secretary for Defense, because I had made no mysteries in internal conversations about my skepticism in this urge to move closer to NATO, because my position has always been what makes our power, what makes our role or our usefulness in the world is that we keep a credible neutrality, and for that we have to keep distance from the big powers. But now the Americans were really feeling that they are winning a battle, that Switzerland will forever be another toy in their hand, and I'm not sure it is reversible. And they didn't want to run the risk to slow down this process or to have obstacles and to have a NATO skeptic as State Secretary for Defense. So that's why they launched this odious smear campaign against me. So, it's not just, they are really ready to use means to bring Switzerland in line that they had, that I would, frankly, I was naive. I would never have thought that they would use such means to make sure that Switzerland would sort of be aligned in the US camp.
I didn't mention this in my introduction, but last year you suffered from this horrible smear campaign, which in the end prevented you from taking up that position of being the chief of this new secretariat for
and when you see the scandals that happen almost every month in the defense department, you understand why they didn't want an independent person like me to try to oversee their work. The latest one is the total failure of the purchase of drones for 300 million from Israel. Now, this week, there was a press conference where they said that, first, the drones that had to be put in service in 2019 will not be operational before 2029. And apparently, they will have to be accompanied by a helicopter or a plane. So you really wonder why you need a drone if there is a plane next to it. And this is the expression of sheer but dramatic incompetence. And this incompetence is the result of a blind trust into the Americans and their Israeli friends. In this case, this is procurement, but this is also true for the general assessment of the situation. If you read the latest report of our intelligence services on the threat towards Switzerland, you would believe that this document has been written either in Tel Aviv or in Washington. I mean, the enemies for Switzerland are North Korea, China, Iran. Come on, Russia, of course. Come on. I mean, this is a vision from Washington, but it should certainly not be the vision from Switzerland.
How did that happen? I know that we had an independent foreign policy once upon a time. We managed to avoid 2 world wars. We managed to navigate in the Cold War. We had a very strong fundament for what we would and wouldn't do with certain sides, although there was Switzerland in the Cold War was on one side of the camp, but there was an independence. And now it seems to me that just as in other European states, there are people sitting in very high offices that are paying lip service to neutrality, but are doing everything to push into this one direction, which I believe they actually feel. I think they do. They sign up to this worldview that North Korea poses an existential threat to Switzerland. Do you see
Yes.
that?
No, I think the reason is the persons who are in charge with very little democratic control. You know, it's almost funny that we have created a Center for the Democratic Control of the Armed Forces in Geneva, which is teaching countries in Africa or small countries in Eastern Europe how they have to ensure that the army is under civilian control. And in our own case, there is very little democratic or civilian control over what the armed forces are doing. And simply the people who are in charge, they have been socializing, they've been trained in NATO countries. So quite naturally, they have adopted this mindset. And what happens in the administration of the Ministry of Defense is not anymore balanced either by the foreign ministry, which traditionally was much, much more closer to a true neutral point of view. But our foreign ministry has been largely destroyed by the current incumbent, the current Minister of Foreign Affairs. And also at the level of the Federal Council, now I'm talking about the politicians, the federal councillors, you do not have anymore somebody who has a clear vision of the Swiss identity and Swiss role in the world. We have weak people, which we have traditionally, but weak people who do not have a sense of a role for Switzerland. And we are not in the times anymore when we had people like Micheline Calmire or Pascal Couchepin, or Micheline Calmire in particular, who stood up against the Americans at the times of the Iraq War. She was heavily criticized in those days. But now we know, and even most Americans know, that this war was wrong and that Calmire was right to criticize this war. We do not have any people like that anymore in positions of command. We will see now maybe Beat Jans is there. He seems to be more principled, but he has no real involvement in foreign affairs. So I think it's about the persons and the loss of the consciousness of what it means to be Swiss, what it means to be neutral, and how important it is for Switzerland, but also for the world, I believe, to have a neutral Switzerland.
I mean, you and I, we try to change that back, right? There is a referendum coming that's already a done deal. The referendum will be there. The referendum will ask, should Switzerland go back to an integral neutrality, including neutrality when it comes to sanctions, aka no sanction, except certain little exceptions, but we don't need to go into those details yet now. But what else is civil society doing at the moment to push back? Because I feel there's a pushback in Switzerland too against this kind of megalomania of certain circles, including the media. The media is almost exclusively, not completely, but to a large extent in the same camp of pro-NATO, pro-US, yay. And
yes. Actually, this it's Russophobia. And this Russophobia has been there for a very long time. I was reading the book of my former colleague, Paul Widmer, who is also very much in favor of tradition and neutrality. He just wrote a book about Swiss identity, where he found a quote from the Neue Zürcher Zeitung from 1853, where the Neue Zürcher Zeitung was advocating Switzerland to send 12,000 troops to fight the Russians in Crimea, together with the French and the British. So there is a long tradition of Russophobia in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which I don't really understand. Nowadays, it's pretty clear why they spread this.
The Neue Zürcher Zeitung is Switzerland's New York Times, like, you know, that kind of level.
Yeah, and they are now totally aligned with the pro-NATO, pro-military industry. I think it has to do probably with the economic interests of some circles in Zurich to deepen this cooperation, this military cooperation with Israel and with NATO. But now, as you say, I think the people are very skeptical. The power of the traditional media is not at all what it used to be. People are getting informed through YouTube channels like yours or others, through social networks. And of course, you have lots of questions, lots of interrogations that you can see there. And as I think you mentioned elsewhere, this debate will be really fierce and is maybe one of the most important referenda that we will have in Switzerland. Now, personally, I find it problematic that the concept of neutrality be left to one political party. On top of that, a political party which is nationalist, which is from the right, which proclaims neutrality when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, but is totally pro-Israel in the Middle East. So their credentials for defending neutrality are really not impeccable. For that reason, I'm trying, together with a number of friends, to create also a movement in the French part of Switzerland, which is more neutral, which is neutral in the Swiss terms, meaning apolitical, but simply based on our patriotism and on what we believe should be our identity and our role. For that purpose, in December, we have created a Geneva Center for Neutrality. Why Geneva? Because Geneva is suffering already from the loss of credibility of our neutrality. You can talk to the people who are working in Geneva, in the UN and multilateral sphere. They say, Geneva, Switzerland is not what it used to be, and it's becoming problematic for us to be here. The two main objectives of this center is first, to create a neutral, apolitical framework in Switzerland for the debates that will lead to the referendum. But there is another sense to that, and an international one. We see the rise of blocs, you can say, an increased polarization in the world. Maybe you can divide it by the West against the BRICS. I wouldn't say the West against the rest. There is a risk of increased militarization. There is a risk of commercial wars between these two blocs. And I'm absolutely convinced that for the future of the world, you need a network of states which belong neither to one nor to the other, who can really make the link, build bridges, create spaces for negotiations on important issues like disarmament, for instance, like arms control, like artificial intelligence. I mean, the combination of artificial intelligence with the new military technologies, nuclear technology, but also hypersonic missiles, is extremely dangerous for the survival of mankind. The risk of a nuclear war decided by artificial intelligence is not excluded anymore in the foreseeable future. And for that, you need to have negotiations, to have talks, to have agreements, so have to prevent this and move towards arms control and disarmament. And it seems to me that neutral state can play a crucial role in creating this framework for disarmament.
I'm seeing a lot of interest in this approach in East and Southeast Asia. Do you think that what Switzerland has experienced over the last 200 years, even before, and the institutional capacity it has built, is that still there? Is that still something that Switzerland could say, like, hey, we can link up with others who are interested? Or is Switzerland's position and neutral know-how already so damaged that...
No. Well, firstly, the know-how is there. And I think also in a part of not just the society, but also of the institution, especially in the foreign ministry and in the parliament, there is a desire to try to restore the credibility of our neutrality. But of course, I think it would require a change of casting there at the helm. But this willingness is there. I'm not sure they know exactly how to do that. And certainly, if there would be some openings in Southeast Asia, I do believe that there would be room for cooperation. And actually, this cooperation would be needed and welcome. And I think these things are absolutely possible. And I understand the countries of Southeast Asia because they are the ones who will have to suffer the most, both economically, but even worse in case of rising tensions between China and the US. You know the famous African say, when two elephants make war, the grass in the middle is being damaged.
Yeah.
But be careful, when they make love, it's also the grass in the middle which is damaged.
Very true, very true. Which is why it boils down to this crux of how not to expose yourself nilly-willy to being a battleground. I mean, what we are seeing, the tragedy in Ukraine, one of the main learning outcomes is that actively preventing neutrality from keeping the peace can be a strategy of great powers to weaken their rivals. So the question for neutrals then is, how do you maintain the international capacity to resist your own militarization against the other to be a proxy?
Mm-hmm. Two things there. Firstly, big powers have little understanding for neutrality, especially the Americans, especially the Western powers. And it has to do with their ideological background. They very much see the world in terms of good and bad, good and evil. And you have seen that repeatedly since the Reagan years, if you don't want to go back in time. It is very much anchored in a kind of Christian messianism mentality, which is talking about Satan and God and things like that. So not just a Christian, but the religions of the book, if you want, they tend to divide the world between the people of God and the people of Satan. Plus, you have something like 20, 30 million Americans today who are Christian evangelists who believe that we live in the apocalypse. This is very dangerous. And you remember maybe the apocalypse. You have first you need all the Jews to go back to Israel, and then there will be the Antichrist. So the Antichrist is of course Satan, which will rise up, and there will be a big war, etc. This is very dangerous because it can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, but the fact that in the Western mind you see the world between always good and bad, that leaves no space for neutrality. You are either with us or against us. You are either in the camp of good or in the camp of evil. So that's a mindset which is very present here. I think that makes it very difficult for people like Switzerland to stay neutral against the will of the major superpower with which you are totally connected economically, financially, but also in terms of values.
So the recommendation then would be for countries and politicians in Europe or outside who are not completely ideologically captured to actually reject the entire framework and say like, no, it's not good against evil. We can deal with everybody and we will try to do the best. So like, do not ever get trapped inside this black-white dichotomy.
Absolutely. Right? I think what would be badly needed is to have the creation of a network, and use network because I don't have a better word in my mind, a club or whatever, of states who are aware of this situation and who are ready to work together precisely to prevent this bad against evil mentality to spread out and to lead to wars, commercial wars or military operations of one against the other. Because at the end of the day, it's not only about mankind's survival, but it's also about the sheer interests of countries like the countries of Southeast Asia, I'm sure, but also Switzerland and many others. I mean, if there is a commercial war with China, or if, let's say, if the supply lines are cut between China or Eastern Asia and Europe, I mean, our economy will be in big trouble, meaning our people will be in big trouble with unemployment and things like that. So that's why we have a very strong interest in maintaining the trade routes and the supply lines open. And I guess that this is true also for countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, etc., and all the countries in that region who do not want to be put in a position where you have to choose between the China and the US. But in Europe today, this is a bit the position where we have been put. We had to choose between Russia and the US. Now, of course, when you are in the middle of Western Europe with a landlocked country, the choice is pretty easy to make. But I don't think we have maybe exploited enough the rooms of maneuvering that we had, because at the end of the day, between 2014, where the first sanctions against Russia were decided by the West, and 2022, we could stay outside of the sanctions just by creating a system whereby the sanctions could not be circumvented through Switzerland. Nobody has ever explained to us why this same policy was not possible after 2022. And I think we were a bit quick to join this sanction. In a weekend, actually, we changed. I mean, the Federal Council changed its mind without ever explaining to us why they did that. And I think that this has contributed to a deepened mistrust between large part of the population and the Swiss government. That's why, by the way, they have also lost the 4 or 5 referendum that followed, even though they had nothing to do with neutrality or foreign relations. But okay, to come back to your main point, yes, I believe there is a need for creating a club. It could start with think tanks like yours and mine to create this network of people who think differently and who have a more far-reaching vision of the future and don't want just to be members of a camp. But it's much easier, it's much more comfortable to be part of a camp. You know, if you're a think tank connected to the American military industry, you will see the millions coming, you will see a lot of money, you will have a positive coverage everywhere. Whereas when you want to think differently, which is not going mainstream, then everything is, of course, a little bit more difficult and requires more courage.
Which is why we have to link up with a dissident network. And the good news is there's a sizable number now, including in Germany, Ulrike Gero, including in the United States, Jeffrey Sachs, around the world, who actually are thinking actively in your way of creating centers and creating activities, creating study groups in order to foster a more realist approach. So that's the good news. Let me ask you one more question, because like as realists, we do need to admit that at the end of the day, it all depends on what the great powers actually will do, how they will move, which is why right now the switch from Biden to Mr. Trump is so pivotal, right? Because there might be a big switch in foreign policy. And the way I see it is that smaller neutral states can act as the grease in the machine that gets peace agreements or de-escalatory moves going, but it cannot be the push that overcomes the inertia. Do you see it the same way?
This is exactly the way I see it. The grease is a very good metaphor. Usually I used to use the word of, the liquid that you have in the articulation to make your knee able to function without pain. I think this is exactly the role that we should have. Obviously, the superpowers will keep their autonomy of decision, and there is no way we can really influence the decision-making process. But what we can try to do is to influence the communication and the connectivity between the various great powers. And actually, nowadays, we are moving toward a system which is becoming more complex. You have 3 big let's say the kind of top league, if you want, a Champions League would be Russia, China, and the US. Russia a little bit weaker than the two others. But then you have an increased number of regional powers who have a strong influence in their own region, but not so much at the global scale, which are not global powers. But we can see, we have just seen in Syria, that how much one of these great powers can play a key role on its own. Of course, they talk to others, but that was really the initiative, the resources, the strategy of Turkey to put al-Jolani in place in Damascus. And I guess you will see more and more as the overarching control of the global powers is getting sort of weaker, simply because they cannot anymore control everything. You will see more and more probably regional powers becoming more active as kind of Ordnungsmacht, power of order in their own region. And this is very interesting. This can be a factor of stability in the world.
Yeah, an interlocking system, but that's where we actually need a new proper architecture to agree on a couple of basic ways of interacting. Because right now we're seeing the demise of a system. I hope we can build the future of that. Ambassador Ruch, is there anything that's burning on your heart that you would still like to get out?
Well, I think I said more or less what I wanted to say, but really the point I would like to stress again is how much people who see the world in realistic terms. You have mentioned Jeffrey Sachs. I like to listen to Professor Mearsheimer also, and there are many others. I think it's very important to try to connect and to create a network already now of thinkers, of people who think that way. This is and this can happen now, and this should happen now.
Where should people go who want to read from you or to see more from you? Do you publish somewhere regularly?
So, well, they can first order my book. I'm afraid it's only on Amazon, and I'm sorry because I know some people boycott Amazon, but if somebody has a better option, let me know. So it's called Crimes, Hate, and Tremors. So I think you will already learn a lot from there. Otherwise, I'm preparing with 3 years personalities from the French part of Switzerland, a book on neutrality that should be published in the first half of this year. And otherwise, I'm a regular contributor to a number of outlets, including the weekly Weltwoche in Zurich. I have a column there, but also to some other daily newspaper. But this is more comments about current events. And otherwise, I have many interviews which are available on the net. So don't hesitate. Plus, I'm always open to speak my mind because I have this luxury, like you have, to be independent and to say what I see and what I think without any magnifying glasses one way or the other.
Everybody, if you want to get in touch, reach out to Ambassador Jean-Daniel Ruch. Ambassador, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, and well, enjoy Japan.
I will.